Hey everyone, this is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology, and today I am joined by my friends Kip and Spencer to talk once more about the astrology of sports. We are going to be looking back at the Mars retrograde and some of the final events and themes that seem to have constellated as Mars was coming down the home stretch and turning direct in the sign of Gemini. And we'll be visiting other predictions and observations related to the NFL and the sporting world in general. One of the purposes of this podcast series has been to create content that is also designed to maybe be more interesting or attractive to men. Majority of people who take in astrology content are women, and so we're trying to designate some topics that hopefully there's we know there's plenty of women who like sports too, but obviously just trying to build some bridges so that men might take more of an interest in archetypal astrology, psychology, and the connection between the symbols of astrology and the world of sports and athletics, something that all three of us are also very passionate about in general. So that's our agenda today. Is we're going to kind of do a Mars retrograde, in hindsight, as it's just turned direct. It's actually turning direct today as we're recording this, but you'll be seeing it after the fact. So, and we'll keep doing this once a month. We've been having fun with it, getting a lot of good feedback from you guys. So we hope that you'll enjoy this new episode. As always, before we get into it, don't forget to like and subscribe, share your comments. And you can find a transcript of any of my daily talks on the website, which is nightlightastrology.com. Just had some new classes getting started, Roots and Spheres and Readings and Passages. Check those out on the courses page, or the courses tab. You'll see all the different courses listed under the courses tab on the website, nightlightastrology.com. It's not too late to join. We do have some need-based tuition options available if you need that. And any questions about the courses as you're looking them over, email us, info@nightlightastrology.com. Well, I am very happy to welcome Kip and Spencer back to the show. Hey, Kip. Hey, Spencer.
Hey, friends.
Afternoon.
Good to see you guys again. You ready to look back on there's a lot of really, as Mars retrograde came down the home stretch and slowed down and turned direct, there were a lot of very dynamic events in the sports world that seemed to perfectly grasp the Mars retrograde symbolism that we have to talk about today. And I think also just catching up on predictions for the NFL playoffs as we're coming up on them and stuff like that. So yeah, I'm excited to get into it. I'm going to hand it over to you guys because you guys have a lot of really good talking points for us today. So either one of you guys want to jump in, just go for it.
I think I'm going to drop the bomb first because you and I discussed this beforehand, if it was even something we wanted to bring up. And I pulled up this guy. I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with him. He's a guy named Andrew Tate, who I was just kind of cursorily familiar with. I don't know. He was like a cultural flotsam that I just was, he was on the periphery of my understanding. And then he got into this spat with Greta Thunberg. And the next thing I know, he was arrested. And it turns out the guy's a complete and total sleazebag. But the date of his arrest, which I believe is December 12th, is pretty fascinating. So I'm going to share my.
Yeah, go for it. So just for a little background, if people are wondering, his name, what's his name again?
Andrew Tate.
Andrew Tate. And right, just so people know, he's like I would call him the quintessential toxic male influencer. And he was a former kickboxer. And I just personally don't like his content or his message. I find it misogynistic and terrible. So I know some people there's a whole world of people out there who really like him. But either way, I think probably most people who watch this channel, if you don't know who he is, you would probably find him offensive. And he's the kind of person where you'll see videos about him, trying to talk about how to exert dominance over women and how to be the top alpha dog and all of this stuff. Former kickboxer. And then he was arrested. And Kip, you can take it from here.
So we don't have an exact time for this gentleman. I use noon as I always do. But a couple of things I find really interesting about this. So first of all, safe to say this guy has a Sag moon, Sag sun. Sun and Saturn really close to each other. So this Mars retrograde was hitting, two malefics, a transing malefic hitting a natal malefic, but also hitting both sec lights. And he was arrested exactly as that Mars retrograde that heated up, dividing Mars. It's really been driving a lot of culture and a lot of individuals' lives over the last couple months, right on his natal sun. So kind of ignore that moon. We don't know exactly where that would be, but it's fairly safe to say that he's either a new moon or a very balsamic moon native. And obviously, having Mars stationed opposite your sun for an extended period of time is an uncomfortable period of your life. That's really something that's only going to happen once. So, in general, this is just a period where if this gentleman came to me for counseling, I would tell him to look out ahead of time. That this is going to hurt. This is something that's going to really affect you. The thing that, as someone who wouldn't mind him really being in some hot water, just because I don't necessarily vibe with him, but B, some of the allegations are pretty disgusting and really of a sexual nature. And sometimes when you see negative sexual acts, Mars can be involved here. And you see that transiting his natal Saturn, you see someone being held to account. So I think that this is really A, it's painful for the guy, and B, really matches up with his nativity. The other thing that I think is really fascinating about this, and I'll let you guys riff, is I've noticed this a couple places where folks have had transiting Jupiter aligned in a benefic way. In this case, Andrew Tate has Jupiter and Pisces in his nativity. And so it's almost like he had bonification for his whole chart. It was sort of riding on good luck for a while. Almost the moment that Jupiter moved over, boom, fate took over and he didn't have that lucky horseshoe up his behind anymore. So what do you guys see when you look at this?
I agree that he's a piece of human garbage and basically was accused of sex trafficking young women, and he basically went on Twitter or whatnot to try to brag about his vehicles or something like that, like something like, oh, look at all these vehicles I have, and like in responding in hatred towards Greta Thunberg. Is that how you say her name? Is it Thunberg?
Not sure.
Yeah, just to respond to her about a post she made about climate change. And they found him where he was hiding in a European country based on a pizza box that he was in part of his picture that he shared. So that was kind of, that to me is pretty, that's like the ultimate hubris, right? Like, kind of like, oh, I'm going to try to, be a total a-hole online and Twitter, and like by saying something, the repercussions came pretty strongly for him, as you were pointing out with Saturn.
I forgot about that part, that it was like his reply to her tweet.
Yeah,
she owned him too.
She was like, she ended up saying something like, "That's what you get for not recycling your pizza boxes," or something like that.
Well, she first of all, she owned him by being like, like send me an email, like something like Greta Thunberg are at smalldickenergy.com or something like that, like something like a penis joke, like that. She I don't know. She was she had a really good snappy comeback for his like really audacious, disgusting boasting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, looking at this chart, obviously, it's a noon chart, so we don't know the exact alignment, but Mars opposite your sun and being arrested, for crimes, that seems to fit pretty well. And I think it's interesting to see, like, one of the things that's likely to happen is, between now and March, you've got Saturn about to go over his natal Mars in Pisces. That strikes me as potential for some kind of imprisonment. So yeah, it wouldn't be surprising to me if some further major development were to come about in his story in March, later in March, as Saturn approaches his natal Mars. And then maybe ongoing as it squares his sun. Don't know exactly where his moon is, but yeah. And it also wouldn't surprise me if the long-term fate of this this person and their relationship to potential sexual crimes or continuation of such patterns, if they, like, let's say this person, Andrew Tate, gets out of this somehow. Well, he's got Pluto coming in to square his natal Venus and Pluto, and that doesn't look particularly promising for someone who has these potentially dark, toxic patterns around, women, sex, sexual crimes. I don't know. I don't know what the allegations are. I just know he was arrested, and I'm sure, I can only imagine. So, but regardless of what he did, or what the allegations are, you go, gosh, look at where Pluto's heading in the next 4 or 5 years here, and it doesn't look like it necessarily gets easier. But anyway, those are just some reflections. What's interesting to me is there's a parallel story in the world of mixed martial arts, which is the Dana White story.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, he's the owner or CEO of UFC? Is that what he is?
He's not the owner. I think he's the CEO. He's kind of the face, like the executive face of the franchise or the organization.
President of Ultimate Fighting Championship is what I just Googled.
Okay.
Yeah, so he serves as the president. It's a very lucrative business. He was just again another very Mars retrograde like moment. There was I not on purpose, it just popped up in my like YouTube Shorts feed, which I am exposed to all sorts of crazy things. I mean, it's just like whatever comes up in that feed. Partially is probably because of some of the things I end up watching, because I can't take my eyes off from certain. I'm just like, you shouldn't watch it, but I can't take my eyes off it. But it popped up in my feed where it was like him and his wife slapping each other at a party or something. But more dramatically, I think is him like assaulting his wife. But you can see in the video they get into like they're like punching each other on a New Year's Eve party, and he's obviously, he's a lot. It goes without saying that it's not okay to hit people either way, but like, spousal abuse is the headline in his life right now as a result of getting into this altercation with his wife at a party caught on camera. And then this like very sort of, I don't know what you'd call it, if it was an apology or not that he made, but basically, sort of balking at the idea of having to suffer any kind of public ramifications with his role in the UFC company. So that was all, I thought that was all a very Mars slowing down to station kind of ordeal as well.
I can stop sharing. We don't have to look at Andrew Tate's nativity anymore. We're all spared.
Yeah. I mean, so that's interesting, because in that case you have a scandal and controversy around another figure in the world of fighting. So that seemed to pop up.
Very Mars retrograde topic generally.
Yeah, I mean, there was a couple of other things that happened that I thought were fascinating. I'll just mention a few, again, not like to labor any of these, but there's a very famous fitness influencer on YouTube whose name is the Liver King. He exalts the virtues of manly primal living. He has like all these tenets, including eating a lot of raw animal parts like liver, and stuff like that.
He ate it raw?
Oh yeah. He'll just it's like something out of like Braveheart or something, just blood on the face, eating testicles, like all sorts of stuff.
Raw also?
Yeah, like it'll just be like, it's crazy. And I don't know all the tenets of his system or whatever, but the thing that happened during Mars retrograde was that he was outed for being on steroids, while denying it publicly over and over and over again, because he's selling a natural way of life that will make you look as ripped as he is if you just follow these tenets. Well, it came out, all the emails were leaked of his regimen of steroids that he's taking. I thought that was a fascinating development. And of course, there's a channel called More Plates, More Dates, and it's a famous fitness influencer who basically tries to take you behind the scenes and shows you what's going on when Thor, I forget the guy who plays Thor.
Hemsworth?
How does he?
Chris Hemsworth.
Yeah.
Hemsworth.
And the whole channel is basically about trying to explain to people that a lot of what you're seeing is through the use of PEDs. And so it's like, okay, these Hollywood guys who do the Marvel movies, he'll be like, look at his bone structure of his nose. That's because he's taking growth hormone and this and that. And so it's a channel that's dedicated to saying, don't think that this is all natural, and like, don't set your ideal up here when a lot of this is performance enhancing drugs. And he goes through the science of all of it. So he was on Joe Rogan during Mars retrograde talking about the regiment of things that this influencer, the Liver King, was using. And I mean, it was impressive, like how much he was using. And, so anyway, I thought that was another really interesting Mars retrograde development, that you had a very famous fitness influencer being outed for being on steroids.
Almost a chance to rethink what it means to be actually manly. I know that over the last maybe a couple of years, this whole notion of a manosphere has come up. It's almost like with this period of time while Mars was going backwards, it's the curtain lifted up a little bit and people had a chance to really think about it. You brought up Damar Hamlin, which I think is a really good example of this too. Did you have a chart for that?
Yeah, I have a chart. We can bring that up.
Yeah, that was a huge, I think that was like, I mean, we shouldn't bury the lead, right?
Oh,
that
yeah.
probably was one of the defining Mars retrograde moments that we've had so far. Well, it's done now, but the retrograde period's over now. But yeah, but go ahead, Spencer. Let me put up the chart for you. Hold on.
Yeah, so we've got.
Well, tell us exactly what happened first, just for people who don't know.
So on, let's see, what was the date here? On January 2nd, there was a Monday night football game between the Buffalo Bills and the Cincinnati Bengals. Damar Hamlin, who is a defensive back, was trying to come up to make a tackle on wide receiver T. Higgins of the Bengals. And T. Higgins kind of lowered his shoulder and just like kind of battering rammed him right in the chest, like right in a specific place potentially that actually stopped his heart. And he kind of stood up afterwards, fell backwards, was completely passed out and had to be resuscitated on the field while everyone looked on in horror. They actually postponed the game. They did not complete the game. And then they ended up canceling the game completely afterwards. And, he was recovering in the hospital. He seems like he's doing okay. There were some silver linings that came out of it too, I guess. He had a toy charity for children that he was raising money for children's Christmas presents, and his goal was $2,500, and he ended up raising about $8 to $9 million after his injury. So I thought that was actually a really interesting part of it. But the main thing that I saw in the chart was that Mars retrograde was opposing his natal Pluto exactly at the moment of the injury. And he also was having he had Mercury retrograde was squaring his natal Mercury and Saturn in Aries from Capricorn. And he also was going through a Mars Sun square. So the transiting Sun was squaring his natal Mars in Aries. So he had an Aries stellium, which was like disposed by this retrograde Mars in Gemini, and then the opposition with Pluto. So just really fascinating astrology here.
This is just, as far as mixed omens go, this is just the bag you're looking for. You can teach this chart, because then he also has transiting Jupiter going over entering the house of his stellium and on top of his sun.
I mean, that feels like the fundraiser on some level, doesn't it? Like that he got really lucky that number one, that he didn't die.
And it kept his ticker running.
Right, exactly. And number two, like he was trying to create some kind of expansive Jupiterian charity, and it ended up blowing up into this enormous, huge thing. So, yeah, really, you're right. Very much mixed signals there.
I think one piece of that story that's really interesting is that, obviously, he basically died and then was resuscitated on the field. Like that's, I think from the standpoint of professional sports, you remember at the beginning of this series, when we first started, we were talking about freak accidents, injuries, and the recurring concussions that were happening in the NFL this season. As a bunch of those that stood out. And, I remember I don't know when it was, maybe like last year or something. I was talking with a friend. We were watching a football game together, and I go, I just feel like at some point we're going to see someone never be able to walk again, or we're going to see someone die. Like, in our lifetime, there's going to be something that we see on a sports field that surpasses anything we've seen before. And I don't know, it felt like, we see a lot of things, but the game is getting faster. I don't know, it just feels like there's like a threshold we're going to reach where something about what we see will humanize it a little bit more, because it's in the realm of, you can bet by the minute throughout games on every possible stat line. Fantasy football, it's such a fantasy realm for so many people, and I don't have a problem with that in terms of an archetypal fantasy realm, competition, sports, games. I think they're really important for the human spirit, and so I'm not opposed to that. But there is a human side to all of this, and I find it interesting that this cycle began with Mars square to Neptune, and it's important to recognize that the things that we love, especially like sports, they are kind of like fantasy worlds that we go into. They have imaginal potency, and one of the things that struck me as important about this was the way it was like we all sort of collectively had this. I mean, I don't want to be dramatic, but I think we collectively had a heart shock when it came to like, oh, this is human. And I remember, well, the thing that really stood out to me afterward was listening to several of my different podcasts that I listened to, and how careful the announcers were to make sure that even if it was just not wanting to get in trouble, that they were sounding human. It was like, we have to be human right now. This can't be about the game. It can't be about the stats. It can't be about injury timelines and updates. Everyone was very conscious of trying to make sure that the audience understood that they're treating this person like a human. And I thought that was an admirable thing. Like, overall, I really appreciated that. I also thought that it was interesting to see, okay, in my opinion, usually the sports world, I mean, just in general, it's not like the news or other media outlets where you have to be really conscientious of different discourses that are going on, the language that's used, how you speak. It's very important for not only for ratings, but so that you represent the values of your station or your company or whatever. What I found interesting was watching what felt like a very heightened level of sensitivity that I'm used to seeing in other media worlds come into the sports world for that week. Everyone was being very measured and cautious in the way that they spoke. And I just found that to be a very interesting thing, where it was like sports journalists, who often are paid to be, talking and debating. Like, you think of like Stephen A. Smith and all these personalities that are there to speak fast and have hot takes. And it was just interesting to see everyone making these concentrated efforts to speak from the heart, even if they couldn't quite do it, or even if it was a little bit of a show. I just found that part of it to be really fascinating from a viewership standpoint. It was like this weird, it felt a little bit like, the way that you saw news anchors talking about life when COVID first hit, like everyone just was like being kind of human. And I found that sort of interesting and refreshing.
I agree. And I think this harkens back to that idea of Mars Mars retrograde, giving us a chance to rethink what it means to be manly, and in this manly space of sports talk and sports hot takes. This is a time to be human and not worry about who's dangling the lowest or the heaviest. I thought that in general, sports media really did a good job, and thumbs up for me. And the people who didn't, I'm going to shout out to Skip Bayless here, who is always a jerk, but permanently, in my opinion, stained himself by bringing up the idea that this game needs to get finished right away. It was this immediate hot take on Twitter, and really got roasted for it. And I think I'm in a permanent way. As an interesting aside, Skip Bayless is the famous chef Rick Bayless's estranged brother. They are brothers and grew up together. One of the weirdest things
that is weird.
I've ever heard.
Well, Skip Bayless is also a Sagittarius sun, so he's in opposition to that Mars retrograde. He's not in alignment with the moment. I mean, so that makes perfect sense. And I think there's a number of injuries in the NFL in particular this year that really caused a lot of reevaluation of what the sport should be, what it means to play football. Like we've seen the Pro Bowl change over to flag football this year for the first time, so that's an interesting shift. I
Great
Honestly,
example.
I wouldn't be surprised to see NFL football eventually migrate to flag football. I know that that sounds extreme, and I'm not advocating for that, but I could see it happening. This like revisioning of masculinity is really interesting because I've been reading this book that I really highly recommend. It's called The Flowering Wand by Sophie Strand, and it's about rewilding masculinity and thinking of it as like a fungus or a mushroom that will arise from a collective mycelium. So to me, what that means is that she's talking about myths that arise from different cultures, but it's really talking about staying connected as a community rather than as individuals. And that's what I think the Damar Hamlin experience brought us with the NFL is how do we connect as a community versus being these like individual islands and things of that nature. Because I think that's something that in sports, but in life that men struggle with sometimes is feeling like isolated, feeling like that there's competition with one another. And that book in particular is really great for, I think, community building.
Cool. What was it called again?
It's called The Flowering Wand by Sophie Strand. It's really amazing book. I'm in the middle of it right now, and she's basically making the argument that myth will arise from different cultures that will respond to the conditions that are needed for that particular time and place. And she's really connecting it with some of the actions that are needed to combat climate change and things of that nature, and like cyclical time. And it's really brilliant. She's a great writer, a great poet, and it really is challenging the way we look at these masculine figures. And I think again, I can't recommend it enough.
What do you I mean, just out of curiosity, this is not a criticism, it's just a question. What do you think about women acting as experts about men's that would be a turnoff to me initially. Not that I wouldn't read it, but just initially, if I were going to pick something up and read it, I would be like, well, I don't want to read I don't trust a woman to have authority on this subject.
I think it's a really interesting perspective. Honestly, I think we need strong women voices right now, especially when it comes to things like how do we build community? How do we be responsible masculine men figures in the world? We've gotten to a point where humanity is at risk of basically eliminating itself with the patriarch in charge. And I think it's probably a good time to really highlight feminine voices and sacred feminine. I think that we can still be men, but I think that it's about connecting in a communal way rather than an individualistic, warring way, I guess, because that hasn't worked. We've gotten to a point in history where it's not working anymore. So I'm all for it. I'm open. I'm ready to learn.
It's interesting. I'm still not sure that it's not the first thing I would go to personally, but I hear you. And I'm open to it too. I'm always that way. I'm always like, does that who would I want to hear from on a particular subject? But then I'm always interested if especially if someone has a good recommendation, I'll be always interested to, especially, people like you guys. So I'll put it on the screen so people can check it out too. Hold on, let me
She's
just
the
pull it up.
only voice in that type of movement. I was trying to figure this out the other day. There's like another group on Instagram. I can't remember the name of it, but it is like a rewilding sacred masculinity group that is like a men's group that gets together and tries to figure out how they can relate in a way that is collaborative rather than competitive, or that is, I don't know what the word is.
What kind of stuff do they do? Do they do like activities?
Yeah, I need to do more research on that particular group, but I know there's groups like that out there that are trying to allow men to feel things and not have to hide behind these I don't know, these shells of machismo or the toxic version of that masculinity. Yeah, just it's a wonderful book.
Whoa,
It's really,
Amazon likes it. Holy cow.
yeah. Can you see can you see it on the screen?
Yep.
Yeah.
So there, and just in case anyone wants to check it out, and I probably will too. I appreciate it, and in expressing my skepticism, I'm just trying to be honest about like what my initial response would be in case, and also in case it is for other men out there who are listening. But yeah, I mean, it's not like there's anyone can have a valuable perspective, and I think oftentimes, like I just think of like how often my wife has a perspective that enlightens me. So it's not like I would just discard it. But yeah, that's interesting.
I think the myth teaches us the myths teach us like potentially a different perspective. So I just think it's very well researched, and sometimes the sacred stories can be our teachers rather than just one individual voice. And I think she does a really good job of using those stories to help people connect in maybe in a different way, just finding a new perspective.
Yeah, that's cool. What else do we have on our list to talk about in terms of Mars retrograde / direct updates? Anything else you guys want to look at?
I want to look at the Derek Carr for a second. Like this came out
Interesting.
today or yesterday. So
that was like my number one dud pick. I was like, at the beginning of the year, I was like, I think he's, maybe sleeper for one, like MVP. And I don't remember exactly which transit I was looking at, but yeah, he's had.
Well, he just had like Devontae Adams traded to his team. That wasn't the worst prediction in the world. That was
I was pretty stoked about it at first.
Yeah, but he's an Aries sun, Aries Mercury, and as Mars was stationing, he kind of he's lost his job as starting quarterback of the Raiders. He hasn't played the last 2 weeks of the season, and he came out and said like, I'm done here. I'm going to be moving on, and I just thought that was really interesting as Mars was stationing direct that he was making that declarative statement about a separation.
Yeah, for sure. Another interesting example that I meant to mention today was the Minnesota Twins signing of Carlos Correa, which was especially Mars retrograde because initially he went to the Giants. That negotiation broke down because of some concerns that they had about an old ankle injury. Then he went to the Mets. That negotiation broke down because of the same concerns. And so the Twins, who he played for last year, swooped in and signed him on a lesser deal, one that's probably better, honestly, for the team than a 10-year, 13-year deal or whatever it was he was looking for. So they end up getting him on a 6-year deal, and he ends up coming back to Minnesota through this wild roller coaster of different failed negotiations. And it was, of course, all during a Mercury retrograde as well. So you have Mars retrograde slowing down to station while Mercury retrogrades. And as that's stationing, it was yesterday that he actually signed with the Twins. And
this isn't just some schmo. This guy is one of the best players in the league. I remember when the Twins traded for him. It was such an un-Twins-like move.
Yeah,
somehow they're bringing in, a top 5 guy in the league.
Yeah.
And when he signed everywhere, of course, the entire spectrum of Twins fans were like, of course, we bring the guy in for 1 year and he gets the biggest contract ever handed out by some giant mega market team.
Yeah, totally. I think it's interesting that one of the things that came up in the interview last night in that discussion, which is also very Mars retrograde, is that his agent they were asking him, well, like, what's wrong with his health? And it's like, well, he had an ankle injury a long time ago. He hasn't had any issues with the ankle since. I think the ankle injury was in like 2014. So they were like, he's fine. And the way that the agent spun it when they said, why did this all break down? Is he said, well, there's a considerable gap in the world of sports medicine, which I would consider to be a very Mars in Mercury's sign, like in Gemini kind of. Sports medicine feels like it could be Mars in Gemini. So he says there's a considerable gap in the sports medicine world between practical therapeutic evaluation, meaning like people who work with him and see how he moves and cuts and what his functional abilities are, and those people who are just sitting behind screens who have never seen him, worked with him, have no practical vision of his abilities, who are looking at an MRI and reading it technically. And he's like, there's this huge gap between the different kinds of evaluations and conclusions that these two types of analysts come to in the world of sports medicine. And he was explaining it. And I was just thinking, well, that's also Mars retrograde in Gemini. There being this split or chasm within how data or information is analyzed relative to a sports player and his old injury. So it felt like a very Mars retrograde in Gemini subtopic within the back and forth of the negotiations themselves.
Isn't Correa, didn't he like try to sign with 2 different teams before he landed with the Twins? Like not just one failed signing, it was like 2.
Yeah.
I feel like he went to like San Francisco, New York.
First the Giants and then the Mets.
You got to reread that contract over and over when Mercury retrograde.
What's in his chart? Does this come up in his particular chart, or?
I haven't looked at his chart. I can pull it up while you guys are. Anything else you guys want to mention?
I've got a couple NFL quarterback charts I want to look at.
Okay, cool.
We can wait for Correa.
Yeah, I can pull it up.
Yeah, a couple in particular that I wanted. Well, so for the playoffs, but also we discussed a little earlier this Andrew Tate idea of Jupiter moving out of Pisces, where the natal Jupiter was, and into Aries, and that kind of being where his luck ran out. When we look at Jalen Hurts' nativity, you're going to see exactly the same thing. It's almost to the day. Jupiter moves out of his, the place, first of all, of Jupiter's home, right? Where Jupiter's happy and content, but also where Jalen's natal Jupiter is. And almost the minute it gets out of there, his leg blows up, which of course for him, when you're a guy that bases being a quarterback on your feet, that's the big danger, getting hurt. And it's almost, just like luck running out.
Right. Yeah.
I think one other Mars story that I thought was pretty interesting is Jamal Williams, who was one of the better fantasy pickups I had on my last place team. Okay. But he set the new franchise record for rushing touchdowns for the Detroit Lions, and he's an Aries sun. So there was some kind of like looking back in the history of the Lions franchise, and he had never had more than like 4 touchdowns or something like that in a season. And then he goes to the Lions, and during this Mars retrograde scores 17 rushing touchdowns. And you were talking about like feats that were unusual, right? As far as like scoring feats or things of that nature. So I thought that was a pretty good example of that.
It's unusual for him and for the Lions.
Yeah.
Right. Justin Jefferson breaks the single season record set for receptions and yards for a Minnesota Viking, held previously by Randy Moss. I was at the game when he did it, which was really cool. And yeah, I mean that idea of there being, and he is a Mars, is he a Jupiter in Gemini or a Mars and Gemini guy?
He's a Gemini sun.
His sun is in Gemini, and actually was almost exactly at the place where Mars stationed to go retrograde. Because I remember he and Cooper Kupp were both right there, and that was my test case.
Yeah. So he's had of course, he is very likely he could be offensive player of the year. So, that was definitely my best fantasy choice. Like of all of the players I drafted, I think he was the best for sure.
I specifically avoided him with the first overall pick that I had because of his Gemini sun. And I was worried he was going to get hurt because, I mean, Kip's pick, Cooper Kupp, Gemini sun, like went down a third of the way into the season, right?
Did he get hit? Did his son get actually hit by Mars, or was it the same degree as Jefferson's? Or
really close. I think it did get hit. I think he might have been at 22 and Jefferson was at 24, or vice versa.
Okay, interesting. Well, anyway, here's Carlos Correa's chart. Can you guys see it? Yeah. I'm not sure anything. I mean, I'm just looking at it. Like, does anything? I mean, he does have the Mars in its fall. I don't know. I don't know if that would make a huge difference in terms of how a Mars retrograde transit would go for a person. This is a noon chart. So that's interesting.
He has a Virgo sun, and Mercury was retrograde during this last period of time too. So he might have been feeling that. But also, you see Venus and Jupiter being hosted by Mars. So, his desires are changing. He's second guessing his desire with Venus potentially being hosted.
Yeah, speaking of good luck, his good luck charm was under was being ruled, by that Mars retrograde the whole time.
The other thing is that we don't know when he was born. If he was born, anytime really between midnight and say 10 a.m. Or 9 a.m., you're going to have a late degree Aries moon, which would be getting the square from Pluto right now. So that would be a possibility in terms of a medical evaluation that completely changes the course of your professional career.
Either way, we're likely to have him sign during Pluto squaring his natal moon, so that'll be fun for the twins.
Yeah, I know. That, and how about Neptune opposing his sun too? I'd be a little bit more optimistic about that one because I think sometimes that can translate into glamorous, fame and stuff like that. But the moon one is hard for sure. This is why I typically don't look at the charts of Minnesota sports teams athletes because I get depressed. No, I'm just playing. I thought there was another one that I had on my mind, but anything else you guys have on your list? You want to look at some of those quarterbacks, Kip?
Yeah, let's do that. I want to, we don't need to bring up Jalen Hurts. What I want to do first is bring up a couple folks who had what I thought were particularly benefic charts. So first I'm going to bring up Joe Burrow. The thing that I think is so interesting about this is it just really has, come on. Someday I'm going to figure out how to do this really quickly and efficiently, but it's not right now. So Joe is going to go in, and what I mostly looked at was the Super Bowl, which is February 12th. So we can just put that on. I did this for two reasons. One, of course, that's the big game, and that's what everyone's looking to. But also, if you're going to have a benefic transit that's going to show up during the big game, you had to get there. So grinding through each game, I really only did for the Vikings. But what we're seeing with Joe is we're seeing a lot of shaking things up. You see Mercury going over his natal Uranus. And I think that this year, this isn't as big of a deal because you see Joe as a guy who's been there before. But last year, it was incredibly surprising that Joe ended up in the Super Bowl. And I still think that it would be surprising again. And this shows a lot of surprise. But then the other thing that I thought was particularly interesting was Joe has this natal sun, or I'm sorry, natal Venus transiting Venus, contacting his natal Mars. And why I think that's particularly interesting is that Joe's most kind of notable positive omen in his chart is this Jupiter trine Mars, and they both then sextile Venus. And you see transiting Venus just plugged right in here, just so neatly. And this is really, Venus in her favorite place in the zodiac, sitting in Pisces, just really couldn't be more tightly enwound in everything that makes Joe Burrow's chart kind of benefic. And this really, in a lot of ways, this reminds me, I remember when we were looking at the World Cup, and it was the young player from France who was so good, Mbappe. And I looked at that chart and I said, wow, he looks like he's going to have a great World Cup. Ended up being the first guy ever to get a hat trick in the finals of the World Cup. And this really, in a lot of ways, looks as benefic. Really, really, really happy Venus, just plugged right in to where Joe's chart is particularly benefic. And so, if I had to make a pick, if I were a guy that threw down bets, I think that the Bengals are looking really good based on this chart, especially if they end up making it all the way to the Super Bowl. Do you guys look at this and see anything different?
I mean, I think that your method for the World Cup actually played out a little better than my South Node conjunction method that we talked about. Like I totally biffed on the two finalists, much to my friends in Croatia's chagrin. Although they did bring home the third place trophy, which they were actually very excited about.
The thing is, though, that's such a big deal because Croatia is a small
Yeah,
country.
like
But
4
B, the
million
two
people.
countries, France
Crazy.
has been a juggernaut for a decade now, and Brazil, or I'm sorry, Argentina is like one of the two greatest soccer countries in the world. So it's not, I mean, going for Croatia in that kind of group is really going out on a limb.
Yeah, I mean, well, and I think though, for that particular coach, that probably is a huge success. So I guess maybe if we look at it from that perspective, maybe the method is showing something that is a life-changing event for them.
For sure going to be the top of the guy's obituary. I mean, not to be morbid, but
Sure, sure.
it's like the biggest event of his life.
And
Anyways, I just really think that this Joe Burrow's chart for the Super Bowl in particular is pretty spectacular.
I mean,
It would be hard for me to see the Bengals in the Super Bowl and not think that they're going to win. Other than this one, and I've talked about this before, Tom Brady, when he gets to the Super Bowl, has this amazing fit in his chart.
he's in a 10th house perfection right now too, isn't he? Like with a really lucky Venus activated.
That's like his whole life, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, he's the luckiest football player I've ever seen. Not to say that he isn't talented, but that guy's gotten more breaks. It's just like, I don't know. I'm not a Tom Brady fan. If all of you can tell.
No.
So the thing with Tom Brady's chart is, I don't know how much you guys have paid attention to financial astrology, but the thing you always look for, or always hear, I guess I don't look for it as much as I've heard about it, is Pluto, Sun, Jupiter. And if you look at Tom Brady's chart, every year when we get to Super Bowl time, the sun is in about the same place, and it's always plugged right into his North Node, which, as you've been pointing out, Spencer, it has always been a big benefic signal in when we're talking about sporting events in particular. But then we also have this Sun Jupiter sextile. And I swear, if you go through Tom Brady's life and look at all the times he's been in the Super Bowl, this has been lit up either with Jupiter, which it is here. You know, is it a 3-degree orb? Yeah. But that's still pretty amazing considering we're talking about transiting Jupiter hitting this spot that is one of the most potent 3-planet situations we could talk about in maybe all of astrology. But also, the sun isn't quite there, but the sun is really close to hitting Tom's North Node. So again, you just see Tom with so much going on in his chart at an incredibly benefic time in his life and in the season. You see even this transiting Mars, which is back, he's having his Mars return. Since Mars got towards that station, that's when Tom turned it back up and his receivers got healthy. He had the biggest 3 games of his entire season the last 3 weeks. So we're going to see Mars almost right on top of Tom's natal Mars. And if there's ever been a chappy in the league, a guy who gets fired up and just thrives on getting another dude's faces, it is Tom Brady. I know that he's like Mr. Pretty Boy who has commercials and stuff, but Tom is a wiener, and he will get right up on guys and yell in their faces. And we're just seeing more of that all here for Tom. Again, trying the natal.
What's your birth time that you have there actually? Because
Pluto? You're talking about Pluto,
sorry,
right?
Pluto.
I have time is 11:48 a.m., not p.m.
Do I have PM on here?
Yeah, I feel like his chart is AM because he has.
Well, we can really ignore the specifics of the houses.
Well, mainly you say that because he has Venus like at the very top of his chart, like aspecting his ascendant.
Oh, so it's probably AM, not PM then.
Yeah.
That makes sense. The more important part of this is the transiting planets, and they're just all lighting them up again. And not to like make this gambling tastic, but the odds of Tampa Bay winning the Super Bowl are incredibly low. Like they're right by the Vikings in the bottom of the charts. And I just just every time. I'm a guy that doesn't like Tom Brady too, and I can't tell you how many times I've pulled up his chart when he's gone to the Super Bowl. Just the fact that I can say that out loud, that he's been to the Super Bowl so many times that I've repeatedly brought up his chart makes me mad. And every time I pull it up, I'm like, oh, again, Tom, you.
I've learned not
Here
to
he
bet
is again.
I've learned not to bet against him. I will say that if we looked at that south node, north node technique, I still think that I'm still going to hold with the Eagles, because the Eagles coach has the ruler of his sun exactly on the south node. I think the Eagles are going to lose the Super Bowl. I don't have as much of a solid opinion about who is going to win, although I did see some pretty important positive testimonies for Andy Reid of the Kansas City Chiefs.
What about the Vikings? Come on now, we got we have some hope. No, I'm just kidding.
I'm just waiting for the hearts to break, the inevitable heartbreak.
Only a matter of time. Here is my Vikings Giants horary. I'm going to the game this Sunday with a friend, so I pulled this horary for Vikings versus Giants in the playoffs in the first round. I feel like this horary makes me feel pretty good about them getting out of the first round. You've got the ruler of the first house, which is going to represent the Vikings, as Jupiter, pretty much bang on the ascendant. And then you have seventh house ruler as the Giants, and they are on the 11th house cusp, retrograde and under the beams of the sun. Just the first level of analysis in horary, the way I've been trained with contest horary, is to always look at accidental dignity. An angular Jupiter on the ascendant is superior to the succeedent Mercury, who's under the beams of the sun in retrograde. So I would think that this would go in the first round, that the Vikings would get out of it. Beyond that, they would probably face San Francisco and then likely have to face the Eagles on the road, both games. Doubt it. But it will be a ride to remember, probably one way or another.
Getting 2 playoff games for a first-year head coach, you can't complain about that.
No, I mean, look, if in my opinion, if they make it to the second round, and the only thing I would feel is a total failure is if you see their games. For people who don't know the Vikings, their games this year were one of two things: close games that they won by one possession, typically at the end of the game, or they got their teeth kicked in. They got completely wasted. So I just don't want my goal as a Vikings fan. Realistically, I'm not holding out a lot of hope that they're going to make it to the Super Bowl or win the Super Bowl. But I would like to see them play a competitive game if they get outed. Like if they get outed by the Niners, or if they were to make it through and get outed in the NFC Championship game, I would love to see a game where they lose by a touchdown, not 28 points. Even they lose by 10 points, not 28 points. Something where you have some hope that they're learning how to be a more competitive team in big moments. I think to me, that would be a step in the right direction for a rookie coach with a lot of a talented young core. As a Vikings fan, I have to say I'm very skeptical about whether or not Kirk Cousins has the destiny of a Joe Burrow, a Josh Allen, a Patrick Mahomes in terms of someone, even a Matthew Stafford, someone who can win Super Bowl. I just don't feel it. I'm like, he's good, but he's just not, it doesn't feel like he has the it factor. Even like, goofy Eli Manning, who could just go on these tears and win a couple Super Bowls. I'm just not sure he has that destiny. I could be wrong. One thing that'll be interesting is next year, Cousins will be in a contract year, and he has Uranus squaring his sun in Leo. To me, that could be a breakthrough year in terms of performance, especially if you're playing for a new contract.
Of course.
Maybe that's something to get excited about, but frankly, I wouldn't be upset if they go out in embarrassing fashion in the playoffs. Then, like Spencer, who is ready to move on from Aaron Rodgers and see the Jordan Love era begin, I'd be ready for a new quarterback in Minnesota myself if that happened to us in the playoffs.
Yeah, you all might start to understand the heartbreak of like being a game or two away from the Super Bowl and then just having your heart ripped out, and that's not fun. I mean, It's fun to win during the regular season. I mean, let's not beat around the bush. I think I'd rather be a good team than be a shit one. But I think that when you get so close to that moment and then you just can't get over the hump, it really is. It's stressful. It's heartbreaking. Um, I don't know. I think that I, I I empathize with all of you Vikings fans. Well, we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. I mean, the destiny
never
isn't
know.
written yet, you know?
You never know.
Speaking of Aaron Rodgers, like I watched a pseudo playoff game between the Packers and the Lions. I know this is like a Viking-centric show here.
No, you're welcome here. You're safe.
But,
Safe space.
yes, I watched what could potentially have been Aaron Rodgers' last game on, ever potentially. It could have been his last game as a Packer. It could have been his last game in the NFL. You didn't know, and he looks like a guy that's ready for a change, to either move on to a different team or to move on to a different life stage. And he has some really interesting astrology in the summer with the ruler of his ascendant, Venus, is going to be going retrograde right when training camp starts, basically at the end of July.
Interesting.
And the ruler of his 10th house, Saturn, is also turning retrograde over the course of the summer. And he'll have Pluto moving into his 10th house. So I think change. I think change is coming. I think
you have his birth time actually.
Yeah, we do have a time chart for him.
Does that mean he has Leo in the 4th?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, so that would mean he also has the long Venus retrograde in Leo over the summer, which could coincide with relocating or something around.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I do think that if the Packers, I don't know, I think most fans are ready to move on at this point. I think that the smart, long-term focused fans probably would have been in support of a trade like Russell Wilson going to Denver and the haul of picks that the Packers might have gotten for that. I still do think that if he decides to stick around and they trade him, they still get a pretty decent package, but I don't think it's going to be as lucrative as last year. But yeah, Jordan Love needs to have his 5th-year option picked up, and it's a $20 million option. And he's looked pretty good in the preseason and in the short periods of time that he's come on in relief. And I just think that the Packers salary cap right now is really messed up, and I think it's just time.
At the risk of getting too sports talk radio and not astrological enough, although I guess Mercury is still retrograde, so contract talk, we can wedge it in. If they don't, either they let Jordan Love have a shot or they don't. And it's kind of, they have to trade him this year and Jordan Love gets a shot, or they keep him for 2 years and Jordan Love gets his shot someplace else. It's the way the contracts line up. Both things aren't going to happen.
Well, and Jordan Love was making some rumblings that if he isn't starting next year, he wants to be traded. So, and I don't know what leverage he has, but probably.
I think it's 100% fair for him to bring it up.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's so interesting how Green Bay has had this weird, it's like a weird karmic echo with Brett Favre. And, it's like this weird thing where it's like the same quarterback thing is happening. One of the things that like you were saying earlier, like, welcome to the Packer pain of making it close but not getting over the hump.
Yeah.
There's another karma that you guys are not familiar with, and it's called the pain of being very excited about shit quarterbacks for about 20 years of your life. So I hope.
I remember Don Majkowski and Randy Wright for those.
Okay.
But I was like 11 years old when Brett Favre came around, so like I've had it pretty good for 30+ years here, friends. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, and it could be like, I feel like the ultimate Vikings, I feel there might be more Vikings fans that are hoping that Jordan Love will suck than they are that our team wins. Because they don't want to see the Packers get a third Hall of Fame quarterback in a row.
Let me tell you, there is a pattern between all of those quarterbacks. Every single one of them has an important benefic planet, Cazimi. So I think that Jordan Love has Venus Cazimi. It's in Scorpio, so who knows if that's one thing. I think that Aaron Rodgers has Uranus and Jupiter conjunct the sun, and Brett Favre had I believe Brett Favre had I think he had a Jupiter conjunction of the sun too, like really close, really
I have
tight.
never looked at Brett Favre's chart, but the idea that he has Jupiter, Uranus, Sun, that is the most Brett Favre thing I've ever heard.
Yeah, totally. That's funny. It was so funny. I remember watching the 2009 NFC Championship game with Brett Favre, and I remember like when he was playing for the Vikings, and I remember being like, he's, we're in overtime, and I was like, you better not throw across your body and throw an interception, and just do a Brett Favre thing here. Like all we had to do was kick a field goal, and he did it, and I was just like, that's just like his destiny. He did that in a lot of big games,
dude. Like he's another one where he just did so many amazing things, but he did so many other things that were like, yes, 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 no.
I know.
The gunslinger.
Especially like sending dick pics. That would be right up there at the top of like oh no, what did you do? What have you done?
He's really sullied his legacy, and I think that's also something that Aaron Rodgers is really almost unfortunately has sort of followed in Brett's footsteps. Is he's really created a lot of controversy at the end of his career, and I'm not sure what he's doing after his retirement, but yeah, it's just a weird kind of thing. Bart Starr was one that kept his reputation intact, but he's a Capricorn, so.
Okay, I mean, this probably is a stupid question that we all would just agree with, but I have to put it out there. Do you guys believe that teams, regardless of, the personnel from year to year, that teams have karma?
Oh, yeah.
Right? Yeah, I totally believe that, which is why I think it would be interesting at some point for us to try to dig up, like Spencer dug up the Minnesota Vikings chart. Because one thing that would be interesting for us to do at some point would be to say, where in the natal chart can we see the quarterback pattern in Green Bay? Like as a natal pattern, it has to be there somewhere. Or the Vikings patterns with kickers, for example. Like where do we see this? It feels to me like
obviously the Vikings kickers in the 12th.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, the Packers chart has a sun in Leo with Jupiter conjoining the sun and like a Mercury, almost Cazimi, and Saturn on Regulus. So, and the Vikings chart has a bunch of like Aquarius placements, like including the sun in Aquarius. So
when Pluto goes into Aquarius, it's going to clean house, and the Vikings are going to capture their power.
And I will say this. Jordan Love has Jupiter in Pisces, so he also has that Jupiterian luck that Aaron Rodgers did with Jupiter in Sagittarius, a domicile Jupiter. So I'm actually feeling pretty bullish on Jordan Love, and I'm ready. That's why I'm saying, like, okay, I think it's time to move on. But I want to know either way, because if he sucks, then you want to move on. You don't want to just, like, wait.
I know this bodes well for me, Spencer, as a Vikings fan, is because your ability to divine with your fantasy football season this year has been so stellar that I know that the Packers are not going to do well with Jordan Love. That's not I'm just teasing. I'm just teasing.
Give me another year. This is my first year in fantasy football.
No, for sure.
Once I understand the rules, you watch out, friends.
I remember my very first year playing fantasy football. I mean, it was just like, oh my God, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. But yeah.
Just wait until I get the number 1 pick and I take Jefferson next year.
Yeah, I know. You would too.
I definitely would.
Oh my God.
Just to see the look on your faces, that's what I would do.
It won't be Najee Harris again. I don't think anyone's going to.
That one.
That was Kipp's. Mine was Carr. Kipp's was Najee Harris. I don't know what yours was, Spencer. Worst picks of the year, but.
Oh, geez. I mean, I had so many worst picks in my fantasy league. I picked Harris. I picked Javonte Williams, who like tore his ACL. I had Justin Herbert, who I thought was going to be a super stud, but ended up being very middling for the entire year. So, yeah, I had some problems with my draft for sure.
Dude, I managed to trade David Montgomery and Deebo Samuel for Austin Eckler. That worked out. That was my best trade of the year for sure.
Go down this rabbit hole again.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that it was for a fantasy year. We're going to do this again, just so everyone's
Have
listening.
we told the Justin Fields story on this podcast? Because I think we should if we
I
haven't.
don't know. Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead before I tell the thing about next year.
At the end of the season, you made some proposals to some of the people in our fantasy football league that were somewhat lopsided, and
I don't know. Were they, or were people? People have their own minds. They have their own abilities.
You traded Antonio Gibson for Justin Fields in the middle of his 40-point barrage.
Look, some people will look at that. Like I'm the kind of person who, like, if I see someone who has a wide receiver deprived team and someone's getting hot, and Antonio Gibson was, then I will be like, hey, do you want Antonio Gibson? And I'll take a high upside guy like Fields, who maybe at this point is going to keep scoring 40-point games. Some people will take that trade. I don't think it's unfair.
You came to me and were like, can I borrow Justin Herbert for a week?
Well, borrow trades are totally legitimate. You can borrow one of my players for a week. We'll trade back next week.
My biggest mistake was like, Justin Fields is really hot right now. And you were like, oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
That's why
That's true. I will say that the Justin Fields trade I proposed was your idea.
Yeah, that's why I know. You're a great friend, Adam, but I'm not trusting you with my trade ideas anymore, dude.
You gotta be cutthroat when it comes to fantasy. I'm just playing. Next year we're gonna do a fantasy league for everyone listening, and we're gonna do it again. And we had a bunch of astrologers in the Kip and Spencer and I and a bunch of other people who were in the league. I think next year what I'm going to do is like take a couple $100 from the Kickstarter, throw it in just for fun. So there's something at stake. Because one thing that also happened is, you have to find, I think having something a little bit at stake, not like ridiculous, keeps people engaged more. I think some people were falling off a little bit.
You should spend that cash on a sweet astrology-based statue or trophy.
Yes. Yeah.
If
totally.
I just had a trophy, that would have been enough.
Yeah, dude. That's a great idea, actually. We'll get like a custom-made like Saturn trophy or something.
Or with like the Nightlight logo on it or something.
Jupiter, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. The Nightlight champion.
The my failing in that story with Justin Fields, or my like embarrassing moment, is that, and I think that this should be said too, is that when you traded for Justin Fields, I was so angry. I pulled like a scene from the league. Like I was because me and Adam, Kipp, last season, Kipp, because me and Adam made like 50 moves.
I picked third.
I know you did. Okay, but my point being is that Adam and I were making like moves every single week, like literally, I think I had 50 moves and Adam had like 48 or something like that. The next closest was like 13. And I was like offering all these trades. I was offering trades to people. They were just not even responding to my messages. And then Adam's like, oh, that's a good idea. Like trades for Fields, for Gibson, who I had earlier in the season. And when I read that, I was so mad. Like, I had a league moment. And pardon my French, but I talked to my partner. I was like, I hope Justin Fields tears his fucking ACL. I'm so I was so angry in the moment because I was really invested. I was doing research. I was doing like tons of like tarot readings every week for each individual stupid player.
Yeah, like one of my wife's cousins, who was in our league, he was like over here right around the New Year. And he goes, so who's this Spencer guy? He made like the most moves in the league and he ended up in last place. Like you'd think, like someone making that many moves, like what was his philosophy? And I was like, the problem was that he was pulling tarot cards behind all of his decisions.
Well, and I was in my defense too, I was a little bit too of a homer this year too. I went with my heart.
Players.
I'd used too many Green Bay players in the beginning of the season. And the other problem I had, for those of you who want to learn from my mistakes, is that I really did a ton of research on the NFL draft before I knew we were going to do fantasy football. And I realized that, man, I didn't really know the league as well as I thought I did, but I knew the draft really well. So I like had all the like rookie wide receivers, and I was like, I'm going to play all these rookies in the beginning of the season. And they ended up doing really well at the end of the season, but it took them a while to get there. And I was basing too many things on potential.
That is a classic first time playing fantasy football move.
Totally.
Yeah.
So I learned that lesson well. So next year coming for
Yeah,
me.
you'll be
Plot and
prepared next year
strategy.
for sure. Well,
Yeah.
we are at an hour and 10 minutes in, so we're going to stop here. I hope that everyone enjoyed this episode and that you guys were able to, learn something new about Mars retrograde, enjoy the ride with us on speculating about sports and the NFL playoffs here. We will do another episode here in February, hopefully before the Super Bowl. I think we ought to try to make some predictions and publish something before the Super Bowl. Does that sound like a good idea?
Great idea.
Oh, yeah, that'd be fun.
Yeah, let's do that. Well, in the meantime, as always, if you guys are new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe. Otherwise, give us the thumbs up. We really appreciate it. Share some of your own comments and reflections on the astrology, your favorite sports teams, things you'd like us to cover too. Feel free to drop some comments in there. We will, as the NFL season is winding down, I think we will be shifting our attention throughout the winter to the NBA. I'm not a huge fan of the NHL, but maybe a little bit of NHL we could get in there. And we can start shifting our attention also to things like free agency and the draft and things like that. So it should be lots to talk about through the winter as well. And it'll be interesting to talk about Mars going into Cancer after it finishes in Gemini, where we can try to debunk the idea that Mars in Cancer makes only poor athletes. There are actually some tremendous examples of very successful athletes with Mars in Cancer that I thought we could look at. So we can do some of those things coming up as well.
Carlos Correa.
Yeah, there you go. Was it Michael Phelps? I believe it's Michael Phelps as well. So competitive swimmer. But anyway, we'll get to that later. Thank you everybody for listening, and we will see you guys again next time. Bye everyone.